Camera. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the European History Lecture for Thursday, January 6th, 2001. A date which will live in infamy! A year ago, insurrectionist rebel scum invaded the Capitol in the worstest event in U.S. history ever. You thought Pearl Harbor was bad. You thought 9/11 was bad. You thought the American Civil War was bad. Nothing compared to buffalo-hatted, red, white, and blue, face-painted jerks running through the Capitol for 3 hours. A tiny proportion of the crowd that was actually there to protest the the counting of the electoral votes for Joe Biden after an election that had highly questionable practices. But that is insurrection, a threat to our democracy like we've never seen before. Certainly not the 9 months plus of rioting that went on in Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington from Antifa, including self-described no-go zones for the police, or the ongoing BLM rioting in Minneapolis and elsewhere. Even though those riots went on for 9 months and the Capitol riot was 3 hours, even though people, several, have been killed in each of those long-term riotous cities and buildings have burned to the ground, and one person was killed, not by the rioters, by the way. One person was killed in the Capitol insurrection. If you listen to the mainstream media, it is the worst thing in American history ever. How dare you? How dare you protest the president's election? Because after all, the Antifa and BLM stuff were peaceful protests, and this wasn't. Now, that's my take on it. Because there's only so much news, propaganda, that I can handle. Now, before I open the floor to just anyone, if you have a different take, and Emma Keith had a wonderful argument against my position that she made with great eloquence during period one. If you have another take on this that refutes my interpretation, I would love to hear it, and I will honor it as best I can. So, does anyone wish to offer an interpretation of why it is in fact genuinely serious and why it does in fact matter? Sam.
Yes. So you could look at it through the lens that the BLM riots, because it's a lot of people.
Yeah.
Weren't centered around the Capitol, which is kind of the heart of our government, and so because this was centered around the Capitol, it was a bigger threat.
Okay, centered around the Capitol. That's a good argument. Yeah. Other points against my position before we do anything else. Okay, Connor.
Yeah, so going off what Sam said, if I look through, not from like a Democratic or conservative lens, but just as me, my background, how I've grown up. Because I've grown up my parents were both in the military. I've kind of grown up in that world, but just looking at that, yeah, it's the Capitol. It's the heart of our nation. It's where our lawmaking body is. And there's this group of people that say they, Blue Lives Matter, support the police, screw the Democrats. And then they go and they storm the Capitol, and they're chasing police officers through the building, and they're just trampling them. Like there's a police officer in the tunnels below. He got crushed, and another one, I think, same thing happened to him. He got beat on by a bunch of guys, and he died in the hospital a couple days later.
Okay.
Which I find it absolutely hypocritical that this group of people that say Blue Lives Matter ended up going, someone died, and then a police officer died, and they injured countless people, and just screwed up the Capitol.
Okay, excellently argued. I'm not going to argue against it, except to say what every leftist has said when I pointed out the death and mayhem and destruction and all those other riots. Is the actions of a few violent people truly representative of the general group? But undeniable. Yeah. And now I'll open it up to anyone.
I do agree that there are aspects of any of the protests in the past over a year. Like, there are obviously going to be some things that are not right. There are going to be fights because people are so impassioned by their beliefs. But I think that the worst part about the White House infiltration was the fact that there's just some random people dressed very strangely, and they were actually able to infiltrate the White House. Like
Or
that one,
the Congress, yeah.
yeah, the Congress. Like that guy, I'm pretty sure he posted like a selfie on Facebook of him.
Buffalo hat guy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That guy. And he was just like sitting in like I think it was the Oval Office. And I just
Nancy
think that
Pelosi's office, that's
Yeah.
the house.
Yeah, and I think that also for especially the rest of the world, it kind of just established like some of the things that are going on in the United States as like from to an outsider, it looked like a joke.
Okay.
Like
No, and that's true. It did not look good in front of the world.
yeah, and I just don't think that it was a good idea. And then that night, I remember that Trump openly supported these people that.
I don't know if he
he
supported the
did.
violence. I think he supported the protest.
Right.
And he makes that distinction. Not everyone does. I do.
Right.
But not everyone does.
Right. You're totally right. But
yeah, no, and he certainly didn't react with as much horror as a lot of other people did. Right. And a lot of people blame him for that.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Actually, there are people who say that Buffalo guy or somebody else left a present, a fecal present on Nancy Pelosi's desk for her, and that's nasty.
It's just a parade of like lack of decorum.
Yeah. Oh, decorum had nothing to do with it. You're
it's
absolutely
disgusting.
Right. Yeah, indeed.
I think another thing that made the Capitol riot different from like the larger, longer riots is there was much greater risk because those were civilians in a building that has a lot of classified information, such as legal documents that have not yet been through the
declassified.
Declassified or through the entire legal process. Meaning, if those citizens are uneducated and find a document that they think is treason, it will only cause more violence and more trouble.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a good thing that it only lasted as long as it did, but it was a higher risk than I think some of the others because the 9-month Black Lives Matter riots had looting and a lot more violence and definitely more injuries and then death.
You're quite right, and that there are things uniquely secure in the Congress and in the White House, which was not attacked, that are not anywhere else. I will point out that in Portland and Seattle, courthouses were attacked that did have private legal documents, but not the same as national security. Are you not? Okay. Circling this way. Jackson.
The thing that interested me the most when I first heard about this, it was interesting. I was in the high school in PR. I hear Miss Fleming. She's down the hallway. She's like, "Our country is burning right now," and I'm like, "What is going on?" I think the most interesting thing was that it was Republicans who were doing it, and they were the ones who were like really against the BLM riots. And I think we all know we can't really fight fire with fire. So
most of the time,
most of the time, I really think it would have solidified the conservative position if this riot hadn't happened.
I agree.
They would have had more of a better stance on the whole thing because
it loses the moral high ground.
Yeah.
Now there are two questions that relate to both of what you said that I'm going to ask before I go to finish you and then Sam. The first question is, do you know what an agent provocateur is?
I do not.
An agent provocateur, an agent provocateur, is somebody who works for the secret police who infiltrates underground movements to try to make them look bad. I was a member and am a member of the Tea Party, which was about 10 years ago a big anti-Obama thing. And whenever we had an event, there were always a few people who showed up who first of all didn't look like us, didn't sound like us, and seemed to be looking for any opportunity to make trouble. And I am convinced, as many of us were, that they were not people who were there because they supported the Tea Party, that they were there because they wanted to make the Tea Party look bad. I hope, and it's probably wishful thinking upon my conservative self, I hope that the majority of those idiots, those jerks, those riotous bastards who went into the Capitol were agent provocateurs, people who wanted to make the conservatives or the pro-Trump people look bad. I can't say that they all are. Reasonably, some of the people must have been conservatives. But it's just, our side works very hard to try to be peaceful. And Tea Party was scrupulously careful to try to be peaceful in our protests. No, you're absolutely right. The violence steals moral authority. It betrays it. The other thing is that Speaker Pelosi was warned weeks before this happened that this could be a dangerous moment. And her security experts did advise her to beef up security in advance. And she refused to on more than one occasion. I find it unfathomable that she would do that. If there was a real plausible threat that she could have averted by beefing up security in advance of the event, that would never have happened. But then again, if that had never happened, the conservatives would not look so bad. I wonder. I'm just putting that out there as a thing I wonder. I don't know. I'm not a mind reader. Sam, and then
So, I mean, having said what I said to support,
well, you were good. Yeah.
I think that the reaction that people had in comparison to what's going on now in cities across America is ridiculous because these.
Do you mean the spate of murders and armed robberies?
Well, so that's the thing, though, is you can't really link it to these riots or the amount of homeless that have come in as a result of the riots, but it's a massive indirect effect of that. And so, you hear about Portland now. They're doing is you can't do anything to get homeless off your property. You're not legally allowed to do that. So what happened? So I know people who live in Portland, and what's happening is they'll go onto somebody's property, and there might be a big fence that prevents them from going onto another property, but all their trash and all their garbage and all their feces end up on the other side of the fence. And there's nothing anybody can do about it.
Because the prosecutors won't prosecute for vagrancy,
No,
which is what the homeless are. They're vagrant.
Right, and if you discharge a gun on your property, you will be sued and you will lose.
Well, because it's Portland.
Right.
My God.
So that's the thing that I don't understand.
I don't understand why anyone would choose to live there
No,
under those circumstances.
And they're moving here.
That's why everybody's moving.
Yeah.
But I just don't understand why we're so focused on insurrection that happened a year ago and not the real problems.
I think you very well understand why the press, at least, is so focused on that.
Well, yeah.
It's fairly obvious.
I don't like it.
Yeah, well, I don't either. And look, as a conservative, I will say that everyone who broke into that Capitol building deserves to be punished to the fullest extent of the law. Because they did engage in something that I think was despicable. But compared to, say, yesterday, the district attorney for New York City, my old hometown, the district attorney has determined that armed robbery is no longer a felony unless somebody actually gets shot.
What?
It's going to be treated as a misdemeanor.
But they're allowed to have guns?
Well, understand, these are criminals who don't have guns legally. But they are the underclass, the underprivileged, the victims of systemic racism. And this guy has determined that armed robbery, do what I want or I'll shoot you, as long as I don't actually discharge my weapon and penetrate you with a bullet, it's a misdemeanor. We'll just, it's like a traffic ticket.
But we all know gun control will fix that.
Oh, of course it will.
Oh, sure, right.
Yeah, there are things going on that I think are much more important. Not to mention what's going on in Taiwan. Okay, fast, because I got to get to Haley.
And I think there's a lot of focus on fixing the homeless problem. But then you legalize drugs and things like that in Portland, which they're entirely legal. You can do heroin and nobody will get mad at you.
Yep.
And the problem with that is then you're just supporting the homelessness. You're not, because they're going to get addicted to that and they're not going to be able to get a job. It's a cycle and it's...
Do you understand that when I was your age, we didn't have a homeless problem? It was just beginning to appear because there are laws that are still on the books in most places against vagrancy. Vagrancy is being in a community without a source of income. We used to call them bums. But one of the reasons we didn't have a homeless problem, aside from the fact that the police did enforce vagrancy laws and prosecutors did punish people who were in areas unemployed without a home, just camping out all the time, which is not good for the community, is we had insane asylums. Most of the homeless, and I'm telling you as somebody who worked in mental health, mental retardation for many years, most of the homeless are mentally ill. Some of them, God bless them, are veterans who've come back from combat who could not find a way to get back into the world. Some of them are just people who cannot handle life in a civilized fashion, and they are incapable of holding a job or doing those other things, so they become homeless. And instead of making our asylums more humane, we closed them in the late 1980s and early 1990s. We just closed them. It's inhumane to put mentally ill people in an asylum. Yeah, it's much more humane to let them live on the streets. My God. No, so there are always people who fall through the cracks, certainly in every society, but it was not anything like it is now because vagrancy laws and insane asylums. People got treatment. Anyway, Haley, you've waited a long time. Thank you, and I did this as honor because I think you're going to say something interesting.
Okay, cool. So, oh boy, where to start? So, first off, do I agree with the insurrection that happened? No. Why? Because it was, like Connor said, it was completely hypocritical of what everything we've been going against. However, I do think, so what happened was, there was, that day actually, Alex Jones was having his own little thing. And people were there. It was miles from the Capitol. And then all of his people stayed in that area. And then he ended up getting lawsuits for him being the cause of this insurrection. So what I'm saying is Alex Jones and Trump and every higher power who might be a conservative is responsible for this insurrection, all very indirectly. I think that is so ridiculous. Another thing is in regards to what you were saying about how people show up on purpose to like rile people up. My dad and I were talking about this when it happened, and it's like, I don't think, because it was completely peaceful. It started out peacefully, but then slowly people started pulling away from that protest.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how would people just randomly go to the Capitol? To all these conservatives, just all have the same idea, let's go to the Capitol, but only a part of them. I think that doesn't make sense. So
Can you clarify what you just said because you lost yourself in your own verbiage.
Okay, so like I don't think that a bunch of conservatives, not even a bunch, a few conservatives who were in this protest decide at different moments by different people coming to grab them and say, hey, let's go do this at the Capitol, would think about that on their own.
Okay, so you think it's organized?
It had to be organized.
Okay, last point.
Okay, and this is another point I really think is really important to this topic is when you are talking to a toddler, and just using toddlers as an example here. My brother, if he doesn't,
I prefer juggling them when I'm talking to them. It gets their attention. Hello! Ah! I'm sorry, go on.
So my brother, the toddler, and when he doesn't feel like you're listening to him, he lashes out. The fact that conservatives are being silenced after saying things that can only be deemed as true means that they aren't being heard, and the only way for people to hear you sometimes is to be, I don't want to say violent, but you have to make your actions big. And so that's what they felt was necessary.
Mahatma Gandhi did nonviolent protests that actually shook British India to its core. It was not violent, but it was very disruptive. I grew up during and after the Vietnam War, and I remember liberals teaching me that dissent is the highest form of patriotism, that protest sometimes is the only moral answer to an immoral government. And I believed them. And I'm a conservative, but I believe them. There are times when you need to do something more than just carry signs. I don't think that what happened on January 6th was necessary. But I'm also telling you, I personally do not trust the election results of 2020. There are good reasons for that. And that is not a fringe theory. That is a theory that many Americans have. And instead of doing audits of the elections or exploring the electoral system or trying to shore it up, many people simply say, shut up. No, I'm an American. I don't shut up. I talk. I use my free speech rights. If you want to punish me, then you're guilty of something. I'm not. I may be wrong. I fully admit the possibility that the election could be totally hunky dory and Joe Biden could have won everything and more. But I would like my concerns to be taken more seriously than if I was a frothing at the mouth, rabid nutcase, which most of the time I'm not. Last word, and then I'm going to Connor, and then we got to move on.
In regards to the election,
Unless somebody else has something that I didn't see. Quick.
in regards to the election, it's frustrating because there is evidence for it. There is evidence for these mail trucks dumping things into the river.
I would like them investigated, that's all. Just seriously, by objective people. But hasn't been happening. Last word.
Right. One, people look for it because microbrew, voodoo dolls.
Wait, microbrew I get. Voodoo dolls?
No,
What? Don't leave Portland!
Donuts.
Oh, okay.
It's a donut shop in Portland.
Okay.
I went there when I was like way young for the Rose Festival.
Yeah.
To see my mom because she was in like the shipyards there, and they have a donut that's this big, glazed donut.
I'm sure it was incredible. Look, I'll tell you, you can't get good Italian food in a restaurant west of the Mississippi River. You just can't. Good pizza, good pasta, forget about it. Good bread even is difficult to get out here. So I get that.
Yeah, well, the serious thing that I want to talk about is comparing the Capitol Hill Ranch to I'll use Portland because I don't want to talk about Seattle Chop Chand. I don't know what that was. But Portland, it lasted for 9 months. Capitol Hill lasted for 3 hours. I do think that they're one and the same. I mean, obviously it was Capitol Hill, which does make it a little bit more serious because national security versus private legal documents in a courthouse. But the way that it went down, in my opinion, was kind of the same as, not kind of, but was the same as Portland. Because you've got BLM protests during the day in Portland where mostly peaceful, police are just hanging out, doing their thing, making sure cars don't hit them. But then nighttime comes, skinny white guy, ski mask comes out, jeans.
You're talking about our heroic Antifa vanguard.
A heroic Antifa vanguard. Yeah, they come out, they start destroying crap, and then suddenly you've got a full-blown riot out front of the federal courthouse in Portland where the federal agents are barricaded inside while people are using fireworks as IEDs, shining lasers in their eyes, and they throw tear gas to disperse the crowd because honestly, that's a very reasonable reaction.
It totally is. It's more reasonable than I would be.
Any other country, they would have been shot.
You bet. Send in the Cossacks.
And then they go out, they're pushing people back, and you have this lone federal agent over here he's getting lynched by a group. There's a video, I can show you the video. He's getting lynched by a group of people in a cloud of tear gas. It's 3 guys just beating on this one dude. And he can't, his hands are tied, he can't really do anything because a lot of police officers and a lot of federal law enforcement, they don't have that self-defense training, or good self-defense training that that gives them any sort of real advantage.
That's why they carry guns.
3-on-1, so he has to whack a guy in the head with his baton. He can't really do much. And then you got Capitol Hill where these guys are running through the tunnels underneath, and there's a door. It's maybe this from here to like where Catherine's sitting. And there's just a line of police officers there, and there's this massive crowd that's just there. And, guys are getting trampled, police officers are getting crushed, normal people are getting crushed. I mean, the violence is, honestly, in my opinion, may not the same, maybe different in the way it was executed, but it's the same. And can't say that these are two very different things. But
I think there is a difference between 3 hours and 9 months, but I agree, violence is violence.
Yeah.
And where the rubber meets the road, there was violence.
Yeah, and the whole thing with the media and how they react to those things, with Portland, they acted like nothing was happening. Because, you have, the DA in Multnomah County, which believes what Portland's in, who's just refusing to prosecute him. And then they refuse to elaborate on that fact, and they just totally ignore it. And then you get to D.C., where the DA there he's got a lot of these guys, they're still in jail, and that's all the media can talk about is, hey, these guys are still in jail. But also, I do think it's a two-way street with conservative and progressive media. Conservative media does.
There is conservative media that is not critical. I will agree with you on that point. There are some.
I'll end on this point because conservative media, I can't remember his name, but there was Trump pardoned a U.S. Army captain before that worked for war crimes. Can't remember his name for the life of me, but. Tucker Carlson was talking about saying how he was an American hero, did all this, and that, and just totally ignored what his platoon had testified in court. This guy, in my opinion, he's a war criminal. the whole thing that went down was
we don't have
yeah,
time.
I know. But yeah, like it's like Trump pardoned him, Tucker Carlson was like, you know, war hero, but it's like it's totally ignoring what actually happened. He got Afghan civilians killed.
Fair enough.
So like,
now, one should try to be consistent.
Yeah,
very
like,
difficult, but one should try.
I think the two riots, they're very similar.
The last thing I will say on this is there's an old saying, there are 5 boxes, or 4 boxes, whatever, you'll see how many, to be used in the defense of freedom. Use them in this order. The soapbox, that refers to speaking out. You stand up on a soapbox, you make a speech. The second, the ballot box. You vote, put votes in a ballot box. Third, the jury box. If things get brought to court, you take part as a member of the jury and you do your best. And fourth, the ammo box. Now, our founding fathers rebelled against their God-given king. They wanted to make sure that we didn't have to do that again, except in really extreme cases. So we have a Second Amendment so that if we need to, we can defend ourselves even against our own government. We have a First Amendment so that we can speak. We have a Constitution that can be amended, and has been 28 times. We have a system that does not require violence. We don't need to be violent in this country. Most of the time, we can get what we want through the soapbox, the ballot box, and maybe the jury box. To reach for the ammo box right away, I think, is a mistake. Unless, if things change, if we end up with brown shirts, marching down the street and making laws, that would be different. But we're not there yet. Anyway, thank you for the conversation. This is one of the lovely things about living in a free society. Sometimes people act like, bad people. Okay, so we talked about the old pre-industrial society and the power of the market and the price system and the way that people will actually work together to produce the most amazing things, who would never otherwise willingly interact with one another. The analogy I'll give is, again, my family's from New York City, from the Bronx. And in New York, there are ethnic neighborhoods, and there were ethnic neighborhoods, and there probably always will be. But almost nobody can live in the ethnic neighborhood 24/7, 365. Most people have to get up and go to work outside the neighborhood. That means you may be in a Dominican neighborhood, and at home you speak Dominican variant Spanish, and you go to Dominican grocery stores and so on and so forth. But you've got to be able to navigate the subways, ride the buses, get a job, and you're probably going to be getting a job in some mainstream institutions. You need to learn American standards of hygiene, American standards of dress, American standards of behavior. And one of the good things about a big city like New York over the generations is that it takes people who have foreign ways, and it is a transition into the American way of life. You cannot simply live in your own ghetto. One of the worst things about allowing people to immigrate into this country and go directly onto welfare is it robs them of this need to go out of their comfort zone, out of their little ethnic enclave, into the wider world. And what it does then is it pigeonholes them as dependent people who are incapable of functioning on their own. In New York, when my ancestors came here, that was not the case. You had to adapt to your new land. Okay, industry. Industry in the Middle Ages and in early modern times was primarily cottage industry. That means that you have in your home an area for work. In fact, your home may be a workshop with beds. A lot of peasants would live in houses where they're doing food production and they're working on clothing, they've got a loom, they've got a bunch of other things to work. But, okay, I have time for this. In our valley, we have a lot of sheep. And so what we're going to do is we are going to each, in our own families, make sweaters because it gets cold. like today. So everyone, particularly the women folk, learn how to make a sweater in their own family way. I, as an entrepreneur, come in and say, I will buy sweaters from all of you at a certain flat rate. Now, this is cash money that you can't get any other way. So for a while, any extra sweaters that your family makes will be presented to me, and I'll buy them if they're at all good, and I will sell them. So now I, as an entrepreneur, am providing a market for extra sweaters. You're not just making sweaters for your family anymore. You're making them for me so that I can go sell them in the cities. But the quality really varies. You make the best sweaters in the valley. And I want everyone to learn her way of making the best sweaters in the valley. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to find a way to encourage everyone to learn from her. And I'll give you a bit of extra money because you're teaching people. And so in that way, we'll get a more standard product. And with a more standard product of higher quality, we'll all make more money because we'll sell more sweaters and we'll buy more. I'll buy more sweaters from you. But you guys, oh God, you have your own ways. You don't like her way of doing things. In fact, you think your ways are better. So how, other than just not buying anything from you, how can I encourage you to do things in a uniform way? Well, yeah.
Pay less for theirs.
Well, that's one way, but there's another way. What I can do is gather production under one roof. This is the transition from cottage industry to mills. What I will do is say, I'm going to provide the equipment. I'll provide the looms. I'll provide the sewing needles. I'll provide everything you need. And I'll even provide the wool. But we're going to come together. If you want to work with me, if you want to make money with me, you've got to work under my roof following my system, which is her system. And a number of people will go along with that. And another number of people won't, and that's fine. The people who go along with this are now working in one place, a place that I can control the standards of quality, and I can control the production line. So what I have done is I have turned independent contractors, families who produce wool sweaters, into factory workers or mill workers. I have taken you from your homes and from your various heterodox, diverse ways of doing things and placed you in a common workhouse with common standards of production and of conduct. Those of you who come into my factory are going to make more and more money from me, but you'll have less and less time to work in your homes. And so people make that transition from peasant farmer to factory worker or mill worker, from independent cottage industry craftsman to mill worker or factory worker. This is a step, an important step, where you concentrate production under one roof. And because I can concentrate production under one roof, I can make more money through economies of scale. That means I can buy wool in bulk at a better price per ounce than you can buy, because I'm buying a whole bunch of ounces. Also, I can invest in building a canal or ultimately a railroad from the places where the wool is gathered to the mill, and from the mill to the markets in Manchester or London. I can improve the entire system from sheep shearing to somebody being in a store buying one of the sweaters. I can concentrate production, arrange for shipping by canals and rail, and ultimately I am moving towards something beyond muscle power. I am moving towards a more efficient set of machines that we'll talk about tomorrow using water power and steam power. Questions, comments, or thoughts? Thank you for the conversation. If for whatever reason you were sitting there going, grinding teeth, will this ever stop? One thing that you can do is you can take part in the conversation. It's
a lot more fun.
It is, and if you still, after all this time, think that you're somehow going to be punished for having different views than me, I suggest you think about that, because there's evidence now. You've been with me for a good long time, most of you.
You were talking about how there used to be asylums and that we shut them down.
Yes.
So I do agree with you there that if we had just improved the facilities within the asylum, that it would be better, because right now we have mental hospitals, but they don't do the same thing.
No, they don't. They don't do permanent housing unless you're criminally insane and convicted of a crime. Then they'll house you.
Yeah,
but that's a small proportion.
The thing about the housing portion is, with the asylums, a lot of these patients were getting abused, and that's why they were shut down.
You bet they were.
But
And I agree that they were not
part of
humane.
that is the management's fault, because management controls who you hire. You need to make sure you do a complete background check, and at that time, it wasn't as strict as it is now. So if we did bring it back, I think it would be a lot safer for those people who suffer from mental illness, and it would be safer for the general population.
Well, also, you have to be willing to pay your direct care workers a decent wage. What they often had in the asylums back in the 1950s and before is whoever would work for this really low wage doing this very dangerous, very difficult job. I've worked with people who basically act like predators, and any human being that shows them distraction, they're gonna actually grab you and try to bite you. And I've worked with people like this. It takes a special kind of person to do that job well, and they deserve good pay. Now, if I were king of the world, I would reopen asylums, but I would make sure that they're funded well enough to do a good job. And I would much rather house my insane people in a hospital-like environment that's secure than let them wander around to their own destruction and to the destruction of any victim they made that might come their way.
I think one reason why those were thrown out I think it was because media demonized it, and I think
it did.
That's kind of a trend. It's like the more the more liberal that get, the easier it is to demonize it, because people who are liberal tend to be on they're not rich.
Well, what you might do, if I may, and if I'm wrong, you tell me. Who are you to say I'm insane? Many people who are sympathetic and emotional and empathetic would say that a person who's insane might not be. Maybe you're wrong for being judgmental. Anyway, thank you. Have a wonderful day.